6 months passed, and Volundra healed. The crystal spires that had cracked from the shockwaves of orbital battle were regrown by Aelori artisans, who sang to the living crystal, until it remembered its shape. The gardens that had been trampled by panicking crowds during the bombardment threat were replanted, and the empathic flowers bloomed again in colors that the Aelori said were deeper and richer than before, as if the world itself had learned something about what it meant to survive. The scars in the sky were gone, but the scars in the hearts of 3 billion people would take longer to fade. And the galaxy had not stopped watching. Intelligence reports from a dozen species painted the same picture in different colors, but the message was always the same. The Thyratian Empire was afraid. Not of the Aelori, who were still pacifists and always would be, but of what stood behind the Aelori now. Military analysts across the Empire had done the mathematics, and the mathematics were terrifying. 12 Terran ships had destroyed 40 Thyratian dreadnoughts. The full Terran Accord Navy numbered in the thousands. If 12 ships could do what they had done to the Ninth Fleet, then the full human military was not a regional power, and it was not an emerging threat. It was the single most dangerous fighting force in the known galaxy. And the truly frightening part, the part that made Thyratian admirals lose sleep and pour themselves another drink, was the realization that the humans had known this all along. They had not been building up their strength in secret. They had not been hiding their power. They had simply never had a reason to show it, because they had been too busy building trade routes and exploring dead worlds and arguing with each other about art and politics and the proper way to brew coffee. They had been holding back, not out of weakness or fear. Was expensive and exhausting, and they would rather do literally anything else. But when someone threatened the people they cared about, they stopped doing anything else. The Empire signed a formal ceasefire with both the Aelori sovereignty and the Terran Accord. It was not a surrender, because the Thyratians would have burned their own worlds before they used that word. But it was the first time in 3 centuries that the Empire had agreed to treat a smaller power as an equal at the negotiating table. The reason was 12 ships and 1 man, and the message they had carved into the history of the galaxy with fire. Jonah Marin healed slowly. Human medicine was advanced enough to regrow bone and repair organs and close burns that would have killed any other species. But even human bodies had limits, and Jonah had pushed past all of them. He spent the first 2 months in a medical facility on Volundra, too broken to walk, too stubborn to stay in bed for more than a day at a time. The Aelori healers who tended to him were endlessly frustrated by his refusal to rest, and endlessly charmed by his insistence on thanking each of them by name every morning. Phalith visited him every day. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, and let the bond carry what words could not. She learned more about him in those quiet hours than she had in all the weeks before the battle. She learned that he had been married once, a long time ago, to a woman named Sarah who had died in a colony accident, and that he still dreamed about her sometimes, and woke up reaching for a hand that was not there. She learned that he had joined the military at 17 because he was angry at the universe and wanted to hit something, and that he had spent the next 20 years learning that hitting things did not make the anger go away. She learned that the day he put down his weapon and asked to be transferred to the diplomatic corps was the day he had looked at his own reflection in the visor of his helmet and not recognized the person looking back. He had rebuilt himself from the ground up, piece by piece, choosing gentleness the way a recovering addict chooses sobriety, every single day, knowing that the old version of himself was always one bad moment away from coming back. Through the bond she felt the new weight he carried. The crew of the Prometheus who had not made it to the pods, 14 names. He carried them the way he carried all his dead, quietly, without complaint, woven into the fabric of who he was so deeply that they would never be lost. She found him one morning in the meditation garden, sitting among the crystal flowers in the soft light of early dawn. He had been cleared to walk again 2 weeks ago, and the garden was always the first place he went each morning. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. There was more gray in his hair, and new lines around his eyes, and a stiffness in his left side, where the bones had healed, but the muscles still remembered being torn apart. But when she sat down beside him, she felt the bond open like a window, and what came through was the thing she had been waiting for. The ocean was back, vast and still and silver, stretching in every direction, deeper than before, and marked with scars like trenches in the floor of the real ocean, but calm. The wolf was there too, sleeping in the deep, and it would always be there, because it was as much a part of Jonah as his heartbeat. But the surface was gentle again. "You terrified us," Valeth said. "I know," he said. "Not because of what you did," she said. "Not because of the violence. We expected the violence. Every species in the galaxy told us about human violence, but no one told us about the other thing." "What other thing?" "You were kind the whole time you were destroying them," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I felt it through the bond, Jonah. You grieved for their dead as much as your own. You mourned every Thyrikian ship you broke, every life you ended, even the ones who were trying to kill a world. You felt sorry for them." He was quiet for a long time, and the crystal flowers around them shifted from blue to a deep violet that the Aelori associated with sorrow and understanding. "That is the part no one understands about humans, Valeth," he said. "They think the violence is the frightening part. It is not. The frightening part is that we can do all of that and still feel everything. We do not turn it off. We cannot. We fight with broken hearts, and we win anyway. That is what makes us dangerous. Not that we are strong, but that we are strong, and it hurts us to be." The crystal flowers shifted again, cycling through colors that Valeth had never seen them produce before, as if the empathic resonance of his words was creating something new in the garden itself. Before she could respond, a sound broke the silence of the morning. Small feet running on crystal paths, and high bright voices calling a name that they pronounced slightly wrong, because human phonetics were difficult for Aelori children. The children burst into the garden like a wave of light and color and noise, and fell upon Jonah with the kind of fearless joy that only children were capable of. They climbed on him and hugged him, and pressed their small silver faces against his chest to feel the rumble of his heartbeat. They had brought flowers. Of course they had brought flowers. They braided them into his hair with the serious concentration of artisans performing sacred work, and Jonah sat there on the crystal ground with his scarred hands folded in his lap, and laughed. It was a real laugh, full and deep and warm, and it rolled through the bond and through the empathic field, and across the garden, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Valeth watched him, and felt something settle inside her like a stone finding the bottom of a river. She had bonded with this man for politics, and peace and the survival of her people. She had watched him transform from the gentlest soul she had ever known into something that burned like a god of war in the sky above her world. She had felt him die and come back and carry the weight of his dead without ever asking anyone to help him bear it. And she had fallen in love with him somewhere in the middle of all of it, not with the warrior or the diplomat or the shepherd or the wolf, but with the impossible whole of him, the man who was all of those things at once and refused to let any of them go. Later that day, a ship arrived from Thyratian space, not a warship, but a diplomatic vessel, small and unarmed, carrying a new ambassador to replace the one the Empire did not talk about anymore. She was young, Thyratian, barely past the age of maturity by her species standards, and she walked down the landing ramp with the careful steps of someone who was terrified, but was determined not to show it. Jonah met her at the bottom of the ramp. He was wearing his soft gray diplomatic uniform again, the one with no medals and no weapons, and he carried a wooden box under one arm. He smiled at her, and it was the same smile he had given Valith on the day they met. Warm and genuine, and completely disarming. "Welcome to Volundra," he said. "I think you will like it here. I brought you a gift from Earth. It is called coffee, and I have to warn you, it is addictive in the best possible way." The young Thracian stared at him with wide red eyes, and then looked past him at the crystal spires, and the gardens, and the children who were watching from behind the legs of their parents, with curious silver faces. Her rigid scales softened just a fraction. "Captain Marin," she said, and her voice was careful. "The reports say you are the most dangerous human alive." Jonah's smile did not change. "The reports might be right," he said, "but today I am just a man with coffee. Shall we talk?" She followed him inside. Valith watched from across the landing field, and through the bond she felt everything. The still ocean, and the sleeping wolf, and the grieving shepherd, and the warm, steady heartbeat of a man who had seen the worst of what he was capable of, and chosen to lead with the best. She finally understood what humanity was. Not a species that had chosen between peace and war. A species that carried both, always, in every single one of them, and bore the weight of that duality with a grace that looked, from the outside, like something more than mortal. She closed her eyes, and let the thought move through her, and through the bond, and through the empathic field, until it touched every Aelori on the AA land. Planet, a quiet truth, settling into 3 billion minds, like snow falling on still water. I bonded with him for peace. I watched him fight like a god of war. But the truth the galaxy will learn, the truth that will change everything, is that he was both at the same time. He was always both. The bridge of the TAS Prometheus was burning. Not the clean, controlled burn of a system overload, but the ugly orange burn of real fire, eating through cables and panels and the air itself. Half the consoles were dark, and the other half were screaming warnings in red text that no one had time to read. Jonah stood at the center of it all, with his hands on the manual flight controls, and his eyes locked on the tactical display that showed one thing that mattered. Dral Ket's flagship was 4 minutes from firing a weapon that would crack Volundra like glass. The planet killer was an old weapon, banned by treaties that the Thracian Empire had signed and then ignored. A device that focused gravitational energy into a beam that could shatter the crust of a world and boil its oceans into steam. 3 billion Aelori lived on that world. The children who had braided flowers into his hair lived on that world. Valith lived on that world. Looked at the tactical display and ran the numbers the way humans had been running numbers before battle for 10,000 years, and the numbers were very simple. No other Terran ship was close enough to reach the flagship in time. The Prometheus had no functioning weapons. Engines were at 30%. Shields were failing. There was only one option, and Jonah had known what it was the moment he saw the planet killer charging. Because humans had a long and terrible history with this kind of math. 1 ship for 1 world. 1 life for 3 billion. He opened the intercom and said, "All hands abandon ship. I repeat, all hands abandon ship. Get to the escape pods now. That is a direct order." For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then his first officer, Commander Lena Vasquez, a woman with short red hair and a scar across her jaw and eyes that could cut through steel, stepped up beside him and said, "No. You taught me that a shepherd does not leave the flock," she said. "Well, you are our flock too, Captain, and I am not leaving." Around the bridge, the surviving crew turned back to their stations. Every one of them. The helmsman, who was bleeding from a cut above his eye, sat back down and put his hands on his console. The weapons officer, whose right arm hung useless at her side, worked her panels with her left hand. The communications officer, a young man barely 20 years old, who had been crying silently since the battle began, wiped his face and said, All frequencies open, Captain. Jonah looked at them, and through the bond, Valeth felt something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Pride and grief and love tangled together so tightly that she could not tell where one ended and another began. He did not argue with them. He did not have time. Then hold on, he said, and pushed the engines to there. The Prometheus surged forward, and the stars smeared into lines of light as the battered ship threw itself across the gap between the fleet and the crippled Thracian flagship. Drawl Katz saw them coming. The flagship's point defense batteries, the only weapons still operational on the massive ship, opened fire, and the space between the two vessels filled with a storm of plasma and metal that would have torn apart anything that flew in a straight line. Jonah did not fly in a straight line. Through the bond, Valeth felt his mind shift into a state she had no words for in any language she knew. It was beyond focus. It was beyond concentration. It was a human being operating at the absolute outer edge of what a human body and mind could do, processing information faster than conscious thought, reacting to threats before they fully existed, flying a broken warship through a curtain of fire with the precision of a surgeon and the recklessness of a man who had already made his peace with dying. He threaded the Prometheus through gaps in the barrage that a computer would have calculated as too narrow to survive. He rolled the ship on its axis to present the thickest remaining armor to the heaviest fire. He used the hull of a destroyed Thracian escort as a shield for 3 critical seconds, and then slingshot around it with a maneuver that pulled forces strong enough to crack the bones of anyone not strapped into their seat. On the surface of Volundra, every empath on the planet felt what was happening in orbit. 3 billion Aelori all felt it at the same time. A single human mind blazing in the dark above their world, like a second sun, burning with an intensity that made their own empathic abilities feel small and pale and fragile. It was not rage they felt from him. It was not bloodlust or hatred or the savage joy of killing that they had always been told lived inside every human heart. It was love. Terrible and furious and desperate love for a world that was not his own, and people who were not his people, and children who had put flowers in his hair and called him funny names in a language he had only learned a few weeks ago. He was going to die for them, and he was not angry about it. He was grateful. Through the bond, Valeth heard him speak, not out loud, but inside, in the quiet space between their minds, where only the truth could live. Valeth, thank you for letting me be gentle for a while. She screamed his name, but the bond was only strong enough to carry feelings now, not words, and the only feeling she could send him was a wave of desperate grief and denial, and something else, something she had not admitted to herself until this exact moment, something that felt like the word the Aelori used for the person you chose above all others. The Prometheus reached the flagship of the ship, or the bridge, or the engines. He aimed for a specific junction point where the planet killer's power core connected to the main reactor, a point that was buried deep inside the flagship's hull, behind layers of armor that no weapon in the Terran arsenal could have penetrated. But a weapon did not need to penetrate armor if it became part of the armor. The Prometheus hit the flagship at full speed and drove itself into the hull like a spear into flesh, pushing through deck after deck of metal and machinery until it reached the junction point. 6 seconds before impact, Jonah activated the emergency pod ejection system. 11 pods launched from the belly of the Prometheus, carrying 11 crew members, including Commander Vasquez, who had been physically strapped into her pod by 2 engineers who followed Jonah's secret final order to get her out no matter what she said. Jonah did not get into a pod. He stayed at the controls, because someone had to keep the ship aimed true for those last 6 seconds, and the manual guidance system required a human hand. The Prometheus struck the power core and the explosion was visible from the surface of Volundra. A flash of white light, brighter than the system's star, bloomed in orbit, and for one moment the sky was day. Then it faded, and the flagship of the Ninth Hegemony Fleet was gone, and the Planet Killer was gone, and the TAS Prometheus was gone, and Jonah was gone. The bond went dark. Valeth fell to her knees on the balcony, and the sound that came from her was not a scream, but something deeper, a sound that the Alory empathic field carried across the entire continent. And 3 billion people felt her grief, and knew that the human who had lived among them and loved them was dead. Silence stretched across the world like a held breath. Then, 13 minutes later, a rescue ship found something in the debris field. An emergency pod. Of the Prometheus standard pods, but an old manual unit mounted under the captain's chair. The kind that had not been standard equipment on Terran ships for 50 years, but that some captains still installed, because humans were a species that always had one more trick. Jonah was inside. He was broken in ways that made the rescue team go quiet when they opened the pod. Shattered bones in both legs and his left arm. Burns across 60% of his body. Ruptured organs. Internal bleeding that should have killed him before the pod's emergency systems could stabilize him. But he was alive. His heart was beating with the stubborn, unreasonable persistence of a species that had crawled out of the mud and reached the stars through nothing but willpower and the absolute refusal to die when the universe told them to. Valeth reached the medical bay of the rescue ship 20 minutes later, brought up from the surface by the fastest shuttle, the Alory. She found him floating in a medical pod, filled with blue healing fluid. More broken than whole, more dead than alive. She placed her hand against the glass and reached through the bond and found his mind. It was a quiet ruin. The ocean was drained. The wolf was asleep. Everything that had burned so bright in orbit was spent and dark and still. But beneath the ruin, like a single green shoot pushing through scorched earth, she felt it. That warmth, that gentle, stubborn, impossible warmth that she had felt the first time she touched his mind in the bonding chamber on Calorus Station. He opened one eye, just one, because the other was swollen shut. He tried to smile, and only managed half of one. "Did the kids?" he whispered, and his voice was a broken thing that barely carried through the glass. "Are they safe?" She pressed her forehead against the pod, and closed her eyes, and let the tears fall without shame. "Yes," she said, "they are safe. Everyone is safe." He closed his eyes. "Good," he said. "That is good." He drifted into unconsciousness, and Valeth stayed there, with her hand on the glass, and her mind pressed against his through the bond. And she did not move for 7 hours. Not until Commander Vasquez, bruised and furious and crying, came to stand beside her, and said, "He will live. He is too stubborn to do anything else. Trust me, I have known him for 12 years, and he has never once done the sensible thing." For the first time in days, Valeth almost laughed. Across the galaxy, the news spread like fire. The Ninth Hegemony Fleet was destroyed. 40 dreadnoughts broken by 12 Terran ships. And for the first time in 300 years, the Thracian Imperial War Council convened not to plan a conquest, but to discuss terms. In 100 embassy halls and 1,000 trading posts, and 10,000 ships drifting between the void, the message was clear. The war was over. Stars, species who had watched in silence, began to whisper a new word, Terran. And the word carried weight, now that it had never carried before. The weight of 12 ships against 40. The weight of a man who flew a burning wreck into the heart of a weapon that would have killed a world. The weight of a species that could be gentle and terrible in the same breath, and carry the grief of both without breaking. The galaxy was afraid, and for the first time the fear was pointed in the right direction. The sky above Volundra had always been beautiful. The Aelori had designed it that way, filtering starlight through orbital crystal arrays, so that their nights were painted in soft blues and silvers that harmonized with the empathic field of the world below. Now the sky was full of warships, and the only color was the red glow of Thyratian engines. Dralketh broadcast his ultimatum across every frequency, so that every living being on the planet could hear it. You have 6 hours to surrender the human called Marin and dissolve your illegal pact with the Terran Accord. Failure to comply will result in orbital bombardment of your capital city. This is not a negotiation. This is a mercy. In the council chamber, panic erupted like a physical force. The Aelori were empaths, and when 3 billion of them felt terror at the same time, the emotional shockwave was staggering. Council members wept openly and argued in voices that cracked with despair. Of them, the ones whose fear was louder than their honor began to say the words that Valeth had been dreading. Give them the human. Surrender Marin and save our world. He is only one man. Valeth stood in the center of the chamber and felt the tide of fear wash over her and through her, and she wanted to scream at all of them, because they did not understand what she understood through the bond. Jonah was not just one man. Jonah was a door, and behind that door was something the Thracian Empire had never faced. But before she could speak, the doors of the chamber opened, and Jonah walked in. He was not wearing his soft gray diplomatic uniform anymore. He wore the black and silver combat armor of a Terran naval officer, and it fit him the way a second skin fits a predator, close and clean and without a single wasted line. But his face was calm. Calm as dawn. Calm as the moment before a storm breaks. I need 1 hour, he said, and his voice carried through the chamber without effort. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. 1 hour. If help does not arrive by then, I will surrender myself, and you can dissolve the pact. No one on Volundra has to die today. You have my word. The council stared at him. Through the bond, Valeth felt something new, something she had never felt from Jonah in all their weeks together. It was not fear, and it was not anger. It was anticipation, deep and resonant and terrible, like the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for years. The council gave him his hour because they had no other choice, and because even in their terror, they could feel through the empathic field that this human meant exactly what he said. 43 minutes later, the sky above Volundra changed. There was no warning. One moment there was nothing but Thracian warships hanging in orbit, like iron teeth, and the next moment, the fabric of space itself tore open in 12 places simultaneously, and through those wounds came fire. The Terran 1st Expeditionary Battle Group arrived not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the silent precision of a blade being drawn from a sheath. 12 ships. The Aelori who had gathered in the streets and parks to watch the sky felt their hearts sink, because even those who knew nothing about war could count. 12 against 40. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. On the bridge of his flagship, Dralketh saw the same numbers and laughed, a deep rumbling sound that his crew had learned to fear, because it meant the War Master was pleased, and a pleased War Master meant someone was about to die. He opened a channel to the Terran fleet. 12 ships, he said. You insult the 9th Hegemony fleet with 12 ships. Is this all your kind can muster? Is this what the galaxy is supposed to fear? Jonah stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship, the TAS Prometheus, a ship that was less than half the size of a Thracian dreadnought, but moved through space with a quickness that made the larger vessels look like they were standing still. He was no longer smiling. He was no longer the man who sat in gardens and drank tea and let children climb on him. Through the Sovan bond, Valeth watched from the surface as the transformation completed itself, and it was the most terrifying, and the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. The still ocean inside Jonah did not become chaos. It became something worse. It became perfect order. Every thought in his mind arranged itself into crystalline patterns of cause and effect, action and reaction, move and countermove, stretching forward in time like a chess game played at the speed of light. He opened a channel to Dralketh and said 4 words. "You should have brought more." Then the battle began. Vaylith had read about space combat in historical archives, but nothing she had read prepared her for what humans did when they went to war. The Thracians fought the way they had always fought, the way that had conquered 100 worlds. They formed lines and advanced, and brought their superior numbers and firepower to bear, like a hammer striking an anvil. The humans did not fight like this. The humans fought like water. The 12 Terran ships moved in patterns so complex and so fast that the Thracian targeting computers could not predict them. They feinted left and struck right. They split apart and reformed. They used the debris of destroyed ships as cover and as weapons. They turned retreat into ambush, and ambush into annihilation. Through the bond, Vaylith felt Jonah's mind working, and it was like standing inside a storm made of mathematics. He did not fight the battle that was happening. He fought the battle that would happen 3 moves from now. He saw patterns in the chaos that no Aelori mind could have found. Connections between the movement of ships and the behavior of captains, and the structural weaknesses of Thracian fleet doctrine that turned 40 dreadnoughts from an overwhelming force into a collection of targets. 6 dreadnoughts died in the first 9 minutes. Not damaged, not disabled, destroyed, broken apart into expanding clouds of metal and fire by Terran ships that hit them in places they did not know they were vulnerable. Dralketh stopped laughing. A Terran destroyer, engines failing, and hull breached beyond repair, evacuated its crew into escape pods, and then turned itself into a weapon, accelerating on its last remaining thruster, directly into a formation of 3 Thracian dreadnoughts, at a speed that turned a few thousand tons of metal into a force that cracked all 3 of them open like eggs. Through the bond, Vaylith felt Jonah give that order, and she felt what it cost him. Grieved. Every ship he lost, every life that ended under his command. He felt it, like a wound opening in his chest. She could feel the names of his dead crew members burning through the bond like embers, and she understood that he was not fighting despite the pain. He was fighting while carrying it. Every death made him heavier, and he kept moving anyway. The Thracians had never faced anything like this, because no other species in the galaxy fought like humans. Other species fought to win. Humans fought to win while caring about the cost. And somehow, impossibly, the caring did not make them weaker. It made them relentless. By the end of the first hour, 26 Thracian dreadnoughts were destroyed. 9 were disabled and drifting. 5 were in full retreat, fleeing toward the edge of the system at maximum speed. The 9th Hegemony Fleet, the pride of the Thracian Empire, the force that had never been defeated in 300 years of conquest, was broken. On the surface of Volundra, 3 billion Aelori stood in silence and watched the sky burn. And through the empathic field, they all felt the same thing. A presence in orbit that blazed like a star. A human mind so focused and so fierce and so full of grief that it made their own abilities feel like whispers in a hurricane. Vaylith stood alone on the balcony of the embassy, with tears running down her silver face, and whispered words that no one else could hear. He carries the dead with him, every single one, and he still fights. Then, through the bond, she felt something change. Jonah's attention shifted from the battlefield to a single point of light in the wreckage of the Thracian fleet. Dralketh's flagship, crippled and burning, was not retreating. It was powering up something in its core, something massive, something that pulsed with an energy signature that the Prometheus sensors classified in bright red. Letters as a planet-killer weapon. It was aimed at Velindra. Through the bond, Jonah went silent for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then Valeth felt one emotion from him, clear as a bell in the dark. Not rage, not triumph. A calm and sorrowful resolve. The kind of resolve that a man feels when he knows exactly what he is about to do and exactly what it will cost him, and does it anyway. The weeks that followed the signing of the treaty were the strangest of Valeth's life. Jonah Marin came to live on Velindra, the Aelori homeworld, as the official Terran military attaché, and from the moment he set foot on her world, he began doing something that no one expected. He became one of them. Not in any loud or dramatic way, but quietly, the way rain soaks into soil. Velindra was a world of crystal spires and floating gardens and rivers that sang with harmonic frequencies tuned to the Aelori empathic field. It was a world built for peace and beauty and contemplation, and most off-world visitors found it either boring or unsettling. Jonah found it wonderful. He learned the Aelori language within 2 weeks, not perfectly, but well enough to hold conversation. And the effort alone stunned people, because almost no one outside the sovereignty ever bothered. He sat in the meditation gardens for hours, not pretending to meditate, but simply sitting and watching the crystal flowers shift color with the emotional currents of the people around them. He drank their teas and tasted their foods, and asked questions about everything with the curiosity of a child and the patience of an old man. But it was with the children that he was most remarkable. The Aelori children had never seen a human before, and they were fascinated by him, by his strange flat teeth and his rough skin, and his deep rumbling laugh that they could feel in their chests. They climbed on him like he was a piece of furniture, and he let them. They braided flowers into his dark hair and painted symbols on his hands, and he sat cross-legged on the garden floor and told them stories about a blue world called Earth, where the oceans covered everything, and creatures the size of starships swam in the deep. The children loved him, and children, as every Aelori knew, could not be fooled by pretending, because they read emotions the way other species read faces. If Jonah had been hiding cruelty or deception, they would have known it instantly, and they would have run from him. They did not run. They fought over who got to sit in his lap. Valeth watched all of this through her own eyes and through the Sovan bond, and she could not make it fit together with what she had felt in his mind during the ritual. Every day she probed the bond carefully, searching for cracks in his gentleness, searching for the predator she knew lived beneath the surface. She never found deception, but she found something else. The bond allowed fragments of memory to drift between them. Not full scenes, but impressions, feelings, moments rising to the surface, like stones from the bottom of a river. She saw a boy standing on a green hillside, watching a storm roll across an open sky, and feeling so small and so alive that it hurt. She saw a young man in armor, holding a dying friend in his arms. Of mud and smoke, whispering, "I am here, I am here, I am here," even after the friend stopped breathing. She saw a soldier sitting alone in a bare room, placing a weapon on a table with the slow, deliberate care of someone putting down something very heavy, and saying to someone she could not see, "I am done killing, find me another way to serve." And she understood then that Jonah Marin had not been born gentle. He had built his gentleness the way a man builds a house, one stone at a time, on top of a foundation that was anything but gentle. He was not a pacifist who had never known violence. He was a killer who had chosen peace, and the difference between those two things was vast enough to hold an ocean. The understanding changed something inside Valeth, but she did not have time to examine it, because the war came to Velindra sooner than anyone expected. The Thracian Empire sent an envoy, a war master named Dralketh, to deliver their terms in. Dral Keth was everything the Thiracians valued in a leader. 7 feet of scaled muscle and razor teeth, with eyes like red coal, and a voice that rattled the crystal fixtures when he spoke. He arrived with an escort of armed soldiers, and walked through the halls of the Aelori council chamber as if he already owned them. The terms were simple. Dissolve the pact with the humans, surrender all border worlds to Imperial administration, and accept a permanent Thiracian military presence on Volundra itself. The council members sat in their curved seats and radiated fear so thick that Valeth could taste it like metal on her tongue. Dral Keth could taste it too, she could tell, and he enjoyed it. He turned to Jonah, who stood quietly at the side of the chamber in his plain gray uniform, with no medals and no weapons, and smiled with every one of his 100 teeth. "And what will you do, little human?" he said. "Skirts, when my fleet arrives, will you run back to your little worlds and pretend this never happened?" Every Aelori in the room flinched at the same moment, not because of Dral Keth's words, but because of what they felt in the empathic field. For one heartbeat, less than a single second, the thing inside Jonah woke up. Through the Sovan bond, Valeth experienced it at full force, and it nearly knocked her off her feet. It was not anger. It was not rage. It was something far older and far more terrible than either of those things. It was a total and instantaneous reorganization of a human mind from peace to war. In that fraction of a second, every part of Jonah's consciousness rearranged itself around a single calculation: how to kill everyone in this room and walk out alive. She felt him measure distances and angles and threat levels with a precision that made her own thoughts feel clumsy and slow. She felt him identify the weapons on every guard, the structural weaknesses of Dral Keth's armor, the fastest path to the exits, the exact amount of force needed to crush a Thracian windpipe with a human hand. All of this in less than a heartbeat. Then it was gone. The ocean settled. Jonah smiled politely, the same warm, gentle smile he gave the children in the garden, and said, "I will do whatever is necessary, War Master. I hope it will not be much." Dral Keth stared at him for a long moment, and something flickered behind those red eyes, something that might have been the first seed of doubt. And then the War Master turned and left, with his soldiers behind him. That night Valeth found Jonah in the garden, sitting alone under the crystal trees. She sat across from him, and did not bother to hide the trembling in her hands. "What are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "I am what happens when a species evolves as both the shepherd and the wolf. We are not one or the other, Valeth. We are both, always. The only thing that changes is which one we let off the leash." She stared at him, and through the bond, she felt the truth of every word, felt the wolf and the shepherd coiled around each other in the deep, like two serpents that could never be separated. "Are you afraid?" she whispered. "Every day," he said. "That is the point." 3 days later, the 9th Hegemony Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Volundra system. 40 dreadnoughts, each one the size of a small city, arranged in perfect formation, like teeth in a jaw, closing around their world. Jonah stood on the balcony of the Terran embassy and watched the stars disappear behind the shadow of warships. Then he walked inside and sent a single transmission to Terran Command. 3 words: "Shepherd is down. Direction?" And she knew with absolute certainty that the man who had braided flowers with children that morning was about to become something else entirely. The wolf was waking up, and this time it was not going back to sleep. Valeth Sorani stood at the observation window of Calorith Station and watched the stars burn in the silence of dead space. She was tall, even by the standards of her people, the Aelori, with skin that glowed faintly silver in dim light, and eyes like liquid amber that could read the emotions of any living thing within 10 paces. She was afraid. Not of the station, which floated in peaceful orbit around a star that had died 1,000,000 years ago, and not of the diplomats and traders who wandered its corridors in 100 different shapes and colors. She was afraid of what was coming. The Aelori sovereignty was dying, and everyone knew it, but no one wanted to say it out loud. For 1,000 years her people had been the peacemakers of the galaxy, the ones who stepped between warring species and found the quiet words that ended the killing. But the galaxy had changed. The Thracian Empire had grown fat and hungry, swallowing smaller civilizations, one by one, and they did not care about quiet words. They had already taken 3 Aelori border worlds through what they called administrative integration, which was a polite way of saying they had moved their warships into orbit and told the Aelori living there that they now belonged to the Empire. And the Aelori had done nothing, because the Aelori did not fight. They had never fought. It was not in their nature, not in their culture, not in their bones. So the Council had sent Vaylith here to do the only thing they knew how to do. They sent her to talk. Specifically, they sent her to talk to the humans. Vaylith had read every file the Sovereignty had on the species called Homo sapiens, and none of it made her feel better. They were young, barely 3 centuries into spaceflight, but they had spread across their region of the galaxy like fire through dry grass. They fought constantly, not just against others, but against each other. Their history was a long, red river of war after war after war. Every species in the galaxy whispered about them. The Rethani called them the Smiling Wolves. The Drethii called them the ones who remember how to kill. The Aelori Council had told her before she left, "Bond with one if you must to seal the treaty, but never trust the calm of a human, because it is only the surface of a very deep and very dark ocean." Vaylith had memorized those words and carried them with her like a shield. Then Captain Jonah Marin walked into the meeting room, and everything she thought she knew fell apart. He arrived alone. No honor guard, no soldiers, no warship escort visible on the station scanners. Just a single small diplomatic corvette docked at Bay 7, and a man carrying a wooden box under one arm. He was tall for a human, broad across the shoulders, with dark skin and warm brown eyes, and short black hair that was just starting to go gray at the edges. He smiled when he saw her, and it was not the smile of a predator or a politician. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely happy to meet her. "Ambassador Serrani," he said, and his voice was low and calm and unhurried. "I brought you a gift from Earth. It is called coffee, and I have to warn you, it is addictive in the best possible way." She stared at him. He placed the box on the table between them, and sat down and folded his hands and waited. He did not demand anything, or threaten anything, or try to fill the silence with noise. He just waited, patient as stone, and looked at her with those warm brown eyes. The negotiations took 4 days, and in that time, Vaylith learned something that troubled her deeply. Jonah Marin was kind. Not kind in the way that powerful people are sometimes kind when they want something, but kind in a way that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside him. Spring. He asked about Aelori art, and listened to her answers as if they actually mattered to him. He asked about their empathic abilities and did not flinch or grow nervous the way most aliens did when they learned that the Aelori could feel their emotions. He gave ground in negotiations where it did not matter, and held firm where it did. But even when he held firm, he did it gently, like a parent saying no to a child they loved. On the 4th day, they reached the final obstacle. Under Aelori law, a treaty of this importance required a Savan bond, a partial empathic link between 2 representatives that bound their fates together. It was intimate, almost sacred, and it meant that each of them would carry a piece of the other inside their mind for the rest of their lives. Vaylith explained this carefully, expecting him to refuse. Jonah was quiet for a moment, And then he said, "If it means your people are safe, I will carry a piece of you with me." That sounds like an honor, not a burden. She could not speak for several seconds. The bonding ritual was performed that evening in a chamber of crystal and soft light. Valith placed her hands on either side of Jonah's face and reached into his mind the way her people had done for 1,000 years. She expected fire. She expected rage and violence, and the red chaos that every species in the galaxy said lived inside every human skull. What she found was an ocean, vast and still and silver under moonlight, stretching in every direction without end. It was the most peaceful mind she had ever touched, and she had touched thousands. But then she felt something else. Far below the surface, in the deepest dark, where the light could not reach, something moved. Something enormous, something ancient and patient and coiled like a beast that had been sleeping for a very long time, but had never truly been asleep. There. It did not threaten her, and it did not rise toward her. But she felt its attention turn in her direction the way a mountain might notice an ant. And for one terrible instant, she understood that the calm she was swimming in was not the absence of violence. It was a cage built to contain it. She pulled back so fast that she stumbled and nearly fell. Jonah caught her arm gently and steadied her, and his face was full of concern. "Everything all right?" he asked. She looked into his warm brown eyes and saw nothing but kindness there, and that was somehow the most terrifying thing of all. "Yes," she lied, "everything is fine." The treaty was signed an hour later. Valith returned to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her own hands. They would not stop trembling. Through the new bond, she could still feel him, a quiet warmth at the back of her mind, like a candle burning in another room. Something she did not understand. Something that wore gentleness like armor over a thing that had no name in any Aelori language. That night, a transmission was intercepted by station intelligence and forwarded to both delegations. The Thracian Empire had declared the Aelori-Terran Pact a provocation, and had mobilized the 9th Hegemony Fleet, 40 of their most powerful dreadnoughts, toward Aelori space. Valith read the message 3 times. Then she felt something through the bond, faint but unmistakable. Jonah was still awake in his quarters, and for the first time since she had met him, the ocean inside his mind was not still. Something in the deep was stirring.